He wrote this outline in history about 1920, and then he revised it. And I think what happened, other historians, corrected him on their areas. So I think anyway, I feel like it's a good source. And it's actually 2 volumes. This volume is like BC, I think, I'm almost through and it's still BC. And the next one will be AD. And I wanted to say that Wells, in his lifetime, was regarded as a chief literary spokesman of the liberal optimism that preceded World War I. No writer has caught so vividly the energy of this period, its adventurousness, its feeling of release from conventions of Victorian thought and propriety. Wells' influence was enormous. Besides war, he wrote a lot of science fiction too. I think it's kind of what they're referring to. None of his contemporaries did more to encourage revolt against Christian tenets and accepted codes of behavior, especially as regards sex, in which both in his books and his personal life was a persistent advocate of almost complete freedom. Though in many ways, on the other hand, hasty, ill-tempered, and contradictory. So he's like a real person. He was undeviating and fearless in efforts for social equality, world peace, or what he considered the future good of humanity. So, and then here's what he writes about his history. The outline of history is an attempt to tell truly and clearly in one continuous narrative the whole story of life and mankind, so far as it is known today. It is written plainly for the general reader. And I wanted to also add that it's like not 100% dry. It has some opinion in it. And I think that, like I've read parts of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon, and I can hardly make heads or tails of it, except the Caesars are getting murdered, frequently and replaced. And the army ends up being primarily in control. Who controls the army controls the empire, so to speak. But I wanted to, but he talks about the Roman Empire, but he goes ahead and puts in some opinion on it. And he doesn't have a favorable opinion. And one reason I want to say that is because, sometimes in conservative circles, you will hear someone say, well, similar to what Archie Bunker would say on Married All in the Family, he would say, when did this country go to hell? Was it Herbert Hoover? I thought it was pretty funny, really. But you remember Archie Bunker, right? When did this country go to hell? That's what they say, right? So nowadays they'll say, well, we're going to stop being a world empire because we're losing our morality. Well, and then they'll say the Romans, so they'll compare it to the Romans, the Roman Empire. That's why they declined. Well, he says they never had any morality. He says they were greedy from the get-go, and they had narrow of mind. And now I'll move on to the Buddha. I got to get a drink of water, though. Well, I'll say another thing on the overview. I printed a few pages here, and I kind of thought, and I sent something out too for the Zoomers, and I do have a PowerPoint with just a few pictures on it. And what I thought for discussion, we might try to look at and compare the 8 tenets of Buddhism with the 7 of UU. So I have 7 sheets here for everybody. You can kind of think about it. I thought that might be a fun topic of discussion. I also have my laptop if somebody asks me a difficult question. So now I'm going to start out. I want to show that he's a serious historian. So here's what he's saying. It is interesting to turn from the mental and moral activities of Athens and Alexandria and the growth of human ideas in the Mediterranean world to the almost entirely separate intellectual life of India. Here was this civilization which from the first seems to have grown up upon its own roots with a character of its own. It was cut off from the civilizations to the west and to the east by vast mountain barriers and desert regions. The Aryan tribes who had come down into the peninsula soon lost touch with their kindred to the west and north and developed on lines of their own. They found a civilization already scattered over India, the Dravidian civilization. This had risen independently, just as the Sumerian, Cretan, and Egyptian civilizations seem to have arisen out of that widespread development of the Neolithic culture, whose characteristics we have already described. So I'm sure nobody understood any of that. I know. Oh, you did. You did. All right. Good. We have a winner. So you can pick up your prize at the door. So no, I really. But the reason I say that is I like to show he's a serious historian, and that they're trying to track these sort of ethnic peoples in ancient times. And I always like to talk about the Bible, and so they're trying to figure out where the Hebrews came from. So you've got your Egyptians, the Hittites, the Philistines, the Canaanites, and these are kind of somewhat clearly visible. The Hebrews is less clear where they came from. Also, I'll say real quick, Buddha is a little bit similar to Jesus Christ in that they both were sort of obsessed with spirituality, and also many miracles were attributed to them after their life. So what I'm going to talk about here, and one reason too I said about the opinion part of it, he has weeded out all of the miracles. So now let's talk about, he says they were in a warmer climate. I don't know if that's relevant. They were in a warm climate in which a diet of beef and fermented liquor was destructive. They were generally vegetarian. The soil, almost unasked, gave them all the food they needed. Wandering was unnecessary. The crops and seasons were trustworthy. They wanted so little that trade was undeveloped. Political life was simple. There were no private raiders, no strange traders. One might write a history of India coming down to 400 years ago and hardly mention the sea. The history of India for many centuries had been happier, less fierce, and more dreamlike than any other history. The noblemen, the Rajas, hunted. Life was largely made up of love stories. Like Bollywood, right? Here and there, a Maharaja arose amidst the Rajas and built a city, caught and tamed elephants, slew tigers, left a tradition of splendor. There was verbal tradition, but no writing. There was much profound philosophical speculation, which had still to be brought into clear relation with the philosophical systems of the West. It was somewhere between 600 and 500 BC when Croesus was flourishing in Lydia and Cyrus was preparing to snatch Babylon from Nabonidus. The founder of Buddhism, so here we go, we're getting started now. The founder of Buddhism was born in India. So like, say 550 BC. He was born in a small Republican tribal community in the north of Bengal under the Himalayas. And I have, if you wanted to pull up that PowerPoint, Alan, just blow through it. Oh, there you go. There you go. Because I don't particularly have a specific order for it. But anyway, I knew I had the birthplace of Sidhartha Gautoma, I think it's. And also, there's another slide too that shows there's a temple there now, similar to what we've done with the Bethlehem and stuff like this. But like the next slide. And then I've got the percentage of religions on there. What else is on? And some of the stuff that's on your page. So let me get back. Here we go. So he's born about 550, small Republican tribal community. Little state was ruled by a family, the Sakaya clan, of which this man, Sidhartha Gautoma, I'm looking at David to see if I'm saying that right. Gautama, Sidhartha was his personal name, like John. Gautoma was his family name. Sakaya was his clan name. The institution of caste was not yet fully established in India, and the Brahmins, though they were privileged and influential, had not yet struggled to the head of the system. But there was already strongly marked class distinctions and practically impermeable partition between the noble Aryans and the darker common people. Gautama belonged to the former race, the Aryans. His teaching, we may note, was called the Aryan Path, the Aryan Truth. It is only within the last century that increasing study of the Pali language, in which most of the original sources were written, has given the world a real knowledge of the life and actual thought of Gautama. His story has been overlaid by monstrous accumulations of legend, his teaching violently misconceived. But now we have a very human and understandable account of him. He was a good-looking, capable young man of fortune. And until he was 29, he lived the ordinary aristocratic life of his time. It was not a very satisfying life intellectually. There was no literature except oral tradition of the Vedantic epics, and that was cheaply monopolized by the Brahmins. There was even less knowledge. The world was bound by snowy Himalayas. We've already talked about that. The chief amusements were hunting and lovemaking. All the good that life seemed to offer, Gautama enjoyed. He was married at 19 to a beautiful cousin. For some years, they remained childless. He hunted and played and went about in a sunny world of gardens and groves and irrigated rice fields. And it was amidst this life that a great discontent fell upon him. It was the unhappiness of a fine brain that seeks employment. He lived amidst plenty and beauty. He passed from gratification to gratification, and his soul was not satisfied. It was as if he heard the destinies of his race calling to him. He felt that his existence he was leading was not the reality of life, but a holiday that had gone on too long. While he was in this mood, he saw four things that served to point his thoughts. He was driving on some excursion of pleasure when he came upon a man dreadfully broken down by age. Now this part right here is one of the major traditions, I believe, of the Buddha. And it's a little bit similar to the parables. So he's driving, he saw a man dreadfully broken down by age. The poor, bent, and feeble creature struck his imagination. Such is the way of life, said Chana, his charioteer. And to that we must all come. With this yet in his mind, he chanced upon a man suffering horribly from some loathsome disease. Such is the way of life, said Chana. The third vision was of an unburied body, swollen, eyeless, mauled by passing birds and beasts, and altogether terrible. That is the way of life, said Chana. The sense of disease and mortality, the insecurity, unsatisfactoriness of all happiness descended upon the mind of Gautama. And then he and Chana saw one of those wandering ascetics who already existed in great numbers in India. These men lived under severe rules, spending much time in meditation and in religious discussion. For many men before Gautama in that land of uneventful sunshine had found life distressing and mysterious. They were all seeking a deeper reality, and Gautama decided he wanted to do that. He was meditating on this project when the news was brought to him that his wife had delivered his firstborn son. This is another tie to break, he said. He returned to the village amidst the rejoicings of his fellow clansmen. There was a great feast and a dance to celebrate the birth of this new son, and in the night Gautama awoke in a great agony of spirit, like a man who is told his house is on fire. In the anteroom, the dancing girls were lying in strips of darkness and moonlight. He called Chana and told him to prepare his horse. Then he went softly to the threshold of his wife's chamber and saw her by the light of the little oil lamp, sleeping sweetly, surrounded by flowers, infant son in her arm. He felt a great craving to take up the child in one first and last embrace before he departed, but the fear of waking his wife prevented him, and at last he turned away and went out into the bright Indian moonshine to Chana, waiting with the horses, and mounted and rode off into the world. As he rode through the night with Chana, it seemed to him that Mara, the tempter of mankind, filled the sky and disputed with him. "Return," said Mara, "and be a king, and I will make you the greatest of kings. Go on, and you will fail. Never will I cease to dog your footsteps. Lust or malice or anger will betray you at last in some unwary moment. Sooner or later, you will be mine." These are the words of Mara, the tempter of mankind. Very far they rode in the night. In the morning, he stopped beside a river. He cut off his hair with his sword, removed all of his ornaments, and sent them and his horse and sword back to the house with Chana. Then going on, he presently met a ragged man and exchanged clothes with him. So having divested himself of all worldly entanglements, he was free to pursue his search. He made his way to a resort of hermits and teachers. There were a number of wise men living in caves, going into the town for their simple supplies and imparting their knowledge by word of mouth to such as cared to come to them. This instruction must have been very much of the style of the Socratic discussions that were going on in Athens a couple of centuries later. Gautama became versed in all the metaphysics of his age, but his acute intelligence was dissatisfied with the solutions offered him. The Indian mind has always been disposed to believe that power and knowledge may be obtained by extreme asceticism, by fasting, sleeplessness, and self-torment. And these ideas Gautama now put to the test. He went with 5 companions to a gorge, gave himself up to fasting and terrible penances. His fame spread like the sound of a great bell hung in the canopy of the skies, it says. It brought him no sense of truth achieved. One day he was walking up and down, trying to think in spite of his enfeebled state. Suddenly he staggered and fell unconscious. When he recovered, the preposterousness of these semi-magic ways of attempting wisdom was plain to him. He amazed and horrified his 5 companions by demanding ordinary food and refusing to continue his self-mortifications. He had realized that whatever truth a man may reach is reached best by a nourished brain and a healthy body. Such a conception was absolutely foreign to the ideas of the land. His disciples deserted him and went off in a melancholy state to the next town. The boom of the great bell ceased. Gautama the Wonderful had fallen. For a time, Gautama wandered alone, the loneliest figure in history, battling for light. When the mind grapples with great and intricate problem, it makes its advances, it secures its position step by step, a little realization of the gains until suddenly, with an effect of abrupt illumination, it realizes its victory. So it would seem happened to Gautama. He had seated himself under a great tree by the side of the river to eat when this sense of clear vision came to him. It seemed to him that he saw life plain. He is said to have sat all day and all night in profound thought and then rose up to impart his vision to the world. So that's his primary life story. And then, so now we're going to look at sort of what happened. What happens next, so to speak. Such is the plain story of Gautama as we gather from a comparison of early writings. The common men must have their cheap marvels and wonders. So they're gonna, let's see. Okay, so here's some of the stuff that was made up, apparently. When the conflict began between the savior of the world and the prince of evil, 1,000 appalling meteors fell. Rivers flowed back towards their sources. Peaks and lofty mountains where countless trees had grown for ages rolled crumbling to the earth. The sun enveloped itself in awful darkness, and a host of headless spirits filled the air. Extraordinary attention has been given to the tree under which Gautama had his sense of mental clarity. It was a tree of the fig genus, and from the first it was treated with peculiar veneration. It was called the bow tree. It has long since perished, but close at hand lives another great tree, which may be its descendant. And in Ceylon, there grows to this day a tree, the oldest historical tree in the world, which we know certainly to have been planted as a cutting from the bow tree in the year 245 BC. From this time has been carefully tended and watered. Its great branches are supported by pillars, and the earth has been terraced up about it, so it has been able to put out fresh roots continuously. Okay, so now after his revelation, I guess, he sought out his 5 pupils who were still leading the ascetic life, or his comrades. There's an account of their hesitation to receive him. He was a backslider, but some power of personality in him prevailed over their coldness and made them listen. The discussion was carried on. There was already in those days a belief in India that at long intervals wisdom returned to the earth and was revealed to mankind through a chosen person known as the Buddha. According to Indian belief, there has been many such Buddhas. Gautama is only the latest one, but it is doubtful if he himself accepted the title or recognized that theory. In his discourses, he never called himself the Buddha. He and his disciples formed a sort of academy at the town. They made huts, accumulated other followers. Let's see here. Modern minds apt to be impatient of the tendency of the Indian thought to numerical statement of things, the eightfold path, the 4 truths, and so on. But this enumeration was a mnemonic necessity in an undocumented world. So, and I have your, let's see, I wasn't going to get into, I'm not a Buddhist or an expert on Buddhism. I wanted to say that. And I was going to say too, like if we're interested, we could have that discussion. We could have a Buddhist and we could talk about it, but I'm not, this is my source. It's about all, I don't know too much. I had a boss that said he was a Buddhist, and he said the temple was a double wide in Lexington. But I have the percentage too. There's not a big percentage of Buddhists. I think it's like 5% in the world or something. But let's see, what else can I find here before we go to our discussion? Because one thing I was going to let us briefly recapitulate the 8 elements of the Aryan path. First, right views. Gautama placed upon the stern examination of views and ideas the insistence upon truth as the first research of his followers. There was to be no clinging to tawdry superstitions. He condemned, for instance, the prevalent belief in the transmigration of souls. In a well-known early Buddhist dialogue, there is a destructive analysis of the idea of an enduring individual soul. Next to right views came right aspirations. Because nature abhors a vacuum, and since base cravings are to be expelled, other desires must be encouraged. Love for the service of others, desire to do and secure justice. Primitive and uncorrupted Buddhism aimed not at the destruction of desire, but at the change of desire. Devotion to science and art or betterment of things manifestly falls into harmony with Buddhist right aspirations, provided such aims are free from jealousy or craving for fame. Right speech, right conduct, and right livelihood need no expansion here. Sixthly, in this list came right effort. For Gautama, they had no toleration for good intentions and slovenly application. The disciple had to keep a keenly critical eye upon his activities. The seventh element of the path, right mindfulness, is the constant guard against a lapse into personal feeling or glory for whatever is done or not done. And finally comes right rapture. I don't remember the right rapture. Right livelihood, right mindfulness, right intention, right view. I don't see any right rapture. Stories were built up. A theology grew up about the Buddha. He was discovered to be a god. He was one of the series of divine beings, the Buddhas. In the 3rd century, Buddhism was gaining wealth and power. And the little groups of simple huts in which the teachers of the order gathered in the rainy season were giving place to substantial monastic buildings. To this period belong the beginnings of Buddhist art. There was one other thing I wanted to mention, how the Brahmins, he came into conflict with the Brahmins. The cult and doctrine of Gautama, gathering corruptions and variations from Brahmanism and Hellenism alike, was spread throughout India by increasing multitude of teachers. Quite early in his career, Buddhism came into conflict with the growing pretensions of the Brahmins. As we have already noticed, this priestly caste was still only struggling to dominate Indian life in the days of Gautama. They already had great advantages. So I think, let's wrap it up with this. For some time, Buddhism flourished in India, but Brahmanism, with its many gods and its endless variety of cults, always flourished by its side, and the organization of the Brahmins grew more powerful until at last they were able to turn upon this caste-denying cult and oust it from India altogether. Stories not to be told here. There are persecutions and reactions. By the 11th century, Buddhist teaching was extinct in India. I don't know. Over vast areas of the world, it still survives. But with the loss of India, the Aryan way ceased to rule the lives of any Aryan peoples. It is curious to note that while the one great Aryan religion is now almost exclusively confined to Mongolian peoples, the Aryans are under the way of two religions, Christianity and Islam, which are, we shall see, essentially Semitic, and Buddhism, Taoism, and Christianity alike wear garments of ritual and formula that seem to be derived through Hellenistic channels, temples and priest caste. Egypt, and from the more primitive and fundamental mentality of the brown Hamitic peoples. So with that, I've drifted away from the topic. So let's do a little discussion, if anyone is willing. We don't have to talk about, I find it interesting. I haven't necessarily found a comparison directly one-to-one of these, but they, to me, they look a little similar, the UU principles and the Buddhist ideas. Well, it's not conservative right. It's correct. It's correct. Correct speech. Well, you know, and it can be, I'm sure it can be expanded indefinitely, as in the Talmud or something. You know, I mean, this is just a very, and I've abbreviated the UU things too.
My car reminds me that I wasn't using a microphone. I asked him, what does the word right speech, right action, right livelihood, where is that defined in Buddhism? Do you know?
I don't specifically. Okay. I could look it up. But I think, I mean, do you really have a problem with that? Now, I did expand briefly, some of this, what it means to do right speech. I'm sure you can go on and on and on. But generally, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I'm not an expert on it. You want to come up here, David? Why don't you come up here?
Right livelihood. I mean, that would be a simple idea. Right being, you don't want to make bombs. You don't want to do drugs, that type of thing. You don't want to sell things. You don't want to have a job that is injurious to your neighbor. You want to do right for civilization. You want to do right for the minds and hearts of mankind. Right livelihood.
And right speech, you don't want to tell lies. They were talking about the truth is important.
In comparing the Eightfold Paths with our principles, the question of right is something that we could go around and around with, because who determines the right speech? Who determines the right mindfulness? Who determines the right view? There might be a lot of variations on this, but as far as our principles go, they were established through a lot of agreement on what is right, it seems to me. But with either one, you really can't miss out on living a meaningful life, doing good things in some way.
Okay, so we found a comparison. Overall, the overall packages lead to a good life. Is that a comparison? I wanted to say too about this idea of, there's two things I'd like to point out on this idea of what is right speech. I don't know. He thinks this is right. He thinks that's right. There's a basic thing, which maybe Kara could help with this. There's a basic innate understanding in humans about what's right and what's wrong. And it's not known particularly where it comes from. And you get into your nature nurture. Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it evolutionary? Where did it come from? But somehow we innately, for the most people, for the most part, know the difference between right and wrong. And the other thing I would say is, when you get into this thing about, well, one person thinks this is right, another person thinks that right. And, you can see this on Facebook all the time. Who thinks one thing's right? You're arguing about the details. But if you look at the big picture, it's like David said, don't be a drug pusher, right? Don't sell drugs. It's not right livelihood, to say. This is actually the second time I've read this volume. And actually, well, I won't go. It's neither here nor there, but the dog chewed up I had to get another one. But years ago, an old lady gave me this, and I read it, and I haven't come to it yet, but somewhere in here he talks about what he calls true religion. And he identifies people in the world that had what he calls true religion. And one of the features where you can identify someone who has true religion is they don't care about money. They don't care. And with that, I'd like to close. Oh, did you want to say? We got one more question.
I have to quote my husband.
Okay.
He studied he went to divinity school, and he talked about the word. They talked about the word religion, which has a Greek root, and it means that which ties us to life.
That's interesting.
What, could you repeat that?
She said the word religion, let me see if I understood you. The word religion, root meaning is that which ties us to life.